Colleagues, good morning, good afternoon, whenever you're listening to this. My name is KerryAnn, and I'm a professor of higher education at the University of Maryland, College Park, and also a special assistant to our provost for strategic initiatives. And I've been studying faculty reward system issues for over 20 years. And I want to thank Jesse for the invitation to read your really fantastic white paper and to think with you about these issues of associate professor pathways. I also want to say that in the field of faculty affairs and DEI and equity-minded reform, there are sometimes models, right, of folks that have really done the empirical work, asked the hard questions about whether some of the things we're trying, some of the experiments and interventions we're putting in place work in different contexts and can be scaled up. And Jesse has done some of that work as sort of a rock star in the advance and NSF-funded world. And I was an early connoisseur of her fantastic work. So I'm grateful to have been invited to talk with you about this, I believe, next week. All right. So my title here is Toward a More Expansive View of Scholarship and Impact, New Pathways for Promotion to Full. So some goals for some things I'd like to cover today, really to think about more inclusive and expansive pathways to full professor, including, as you did in your white paper, thinking through how some of the interventions or policy changes could have unintended consequences, and how the language and the sort of practices that we put in place signal different things to folks involved in newer forms of scholarship and on the pathway from associate to full. And also outside of formal policy, practice, and procedure, how we have these discretionary spaces. So by this, I mean places where individuals are making decisions individually in sort of subjective, ambiguous kinds of spaces, whether that be in faculty evaluation processes that are unscripted, or someone sitting in an office thinking about when I should go up for promotion. But a lot of the pathway work happens not only in policy practice, formal kinds of signaling and rules and et cetera, but also in these kind of discretionary spaces. And I've written a little bit about that. All right, I want to start with some stories of Robin, Darius, and Sam. Imagine with me, you've just entered a party for a well-loved dean who's retiring. After the speeches of thanks and congratulations, there's a small reception. Somewhere in this room, 3 associate professors, Robin, Darius, and Sam, mill about talking to their colleagues. Each are reflective about their own careers and couldn't help but notice that the amount of scholarship required to become a full professor in the college has tripled since the dean was promoted earlier in his career. Robin, Darius, and Sam all would like eventually to be promoted to full professor, but they're unsure when and even if they will go up. They're all productive scholars and good teachers, but as they look at recent promotions, as they listen to senior faculty advice, and as they review department and college criteria, they're not sure that they see themselves in their work reflected. Although there are also unclear expectations for teaching and service, the main focus of their concerns, given they're at a research university, is scholarship. So let's think about Robin first. Robin's a physical therapist with a complementary background in gaming. She's designed a series of virtual games that engage stroke patients in strength exercises with real-time feedback. The patient reaches for something and learns how high they're reaching. The game encourages them to reach a little higher as they play, giving real-time feedback. These games have been recognized by an International Physical Therapy Association for innovation and been picked up by 12 hospital systems in her region. Robin has published in this area, though more of the journals have slightly lower impact factors, and she's chosen to publish more in places where practitioners will see the work. Physical therapy is an applied field with an emphasis on clinical practice, so patient impacts will be appreciated by her colleagues when she goes up for promotion. They will care about that. However, when it comes to making a case for promotion to full professor, the only requirement that she's being signaled that she needs to be sure to submit are citations of her work from Google Scholar. And given that other scholars have not been her main audience for this sort of central work she's been doing with these games, The numbers here in terms of citations are unimpressive. Having been present for the tenure deliberations of a colleague who emphasized scholarship of teaching and learning, she's kind of seen her colleagues be skeptical and critical when their work deviated from sort of traditional discovery, and it's given her pause in her own case. Let's turn to Darius. Darius is a biologist who focuses primarily on biology education and broadening participation in STEM. Most of the faculty from Darius's department have received NIH or NSF grant funding to support their research. Darius has not sought funding because he's been able to make meaningful contributions to his field using experience sampling, data analytics, and time diary approaches that use software available from the university. For example, he was able to show that Black and Hispanic students who participated in one of 3 peer tutoring interventions were 3 times more likely to pass the key gateway course in their major. Darius has published his work in biology education journals, and some of his work has been heavily cited. However, he's not sure if it's enough. Darius has published also at the edge of 3 different fields and journal types: biology education, teacher education, and cultural competence in STEM teaching. The interdisciplinary nature of his work has meant that in some cases, the major impact of his work is less directly in biology, as traditionally defined, but more in one of these other 2 fields, and not understood or recognized as well as it could be by biology colleagues. And many of those would be his external reviewers. A senior colleague says Darius must apply and get a particular NSF grant before he goes up, and should try to publish more in mainstream biology journals that tend not to be publishing the work that he's doing. Let's turn to Sam. Sam is an economist with a focus on minority-owned businesses and community development organizations. Sam developed an applied economics lab with local businesses. Each year, they serve over 100 organizations for which she has received small grants. Sam wants to make a case for full professor that she's shown leadership via this university community partnership and revision of the economics curriculum in her department to include service learning. Her applied economics lab has been widely cited by those in education and in business. However, most economists in her field were promoted based on papers, articles, and grants. Although Sam has published about her community engaged scholarship, drawing on her expertise as an economist, she's unsure if the case will be successful. Also, it's been 10 years since her promotion to associate, and the norm in her field is more like 5 years. She's wondering if she missed the window. So I would ask you if any of these situations sort of sound familiar. They definitely do to me as a professor, as the director of our advanced program for 10 years at the University of Maryland, as somebody who has studied faculty reward systems and been an associate dean, working in the provost's office on such cases. And I want to pull out a few of the many things that are present that I'm sure you were listening for, that are relevant to the issues you've been discussing at your institution and in your white paper. So the first one is, this ambiguity about what is enough, right? You heard all of them asking this. And there's this irony in that it feels, as Jean Rice said many years ago, like archery in the dark. What are we shooting for exactly? Nobody will tell you. But then alternatively, you'll have that ambiguity while also having this sense that the answer is always more, and or gets very specific. A senior colleague saying, nope, you got to get this particular NIH or NSF grant before you go up. And the struggle of that, right? So we also saw, on the one hand, let's imagine this is an institution that has said engaged scholarship and scholarship of teaching matter. And yet we are hearing that when it's time to put your materials in, the candidate is instructed only that they need to submit the impact factor and their numbers from Google Scholar or H-Index. So that's an interesting dichotomy, right? That all of these impacts matter, but you only need to send us this one. That definitely sends a message to these folks about what matters. And so there's this ambiguity about whether or not, all 5 forms of scholarship, as you frame them, especially meaningful, engaged, interdisciplinary and problem-based work, is going to count. And there's a lot of noise and misinformation happening in discretionary spaces. And especially if associate professors are getting the majority of their information from a few sources of more senior than them faculty in their own department, as opposed to in a transparent way, in an accessible way, through published policies, examples, in an open forum where not only one or two people's thoughts on this matter and is what is folks are receiving as the way it has to be. And I wanted to tell you that I really appreciated your white paper. I thought, first of all, I appreciated your redefinition of the 5 forms of scholarship. I loved that you defined scholarship more broadly and are, continuing to move that further into institutionalization within the institution. I also thought it was wonderful that you had the parameters for judging scholarship in there very clearly, which can provide guidance for departments and personnel committees. And I also really felt that you underscored the broader, the benefits of broader pathways and how it aligns with your mission. So in joining your conversation today, I want to underscore some things you were already talking about and kind of join the conversation. First, with the importance of this work, but also thinking about some specific changes that institutions have been and can make to their either department, college, or university guidelines, to think about the implications for mentoring and the training of personnel committees, to think about workload practices that will affect associate professor pathways, just briefly there toward the end, and also to provide some examples of some institutions that have are sort of innovating or experimenting really with alternative kinds of pathways. And as I do, I want to acknowledge that I have a few publications that have come out recently that have identified a set of equity-minded principles that might be applied in faculty evaluation. And there's an audit document, and these have been published through the American Council on Education. There were 2 reports and this audit resource that I did with colleagues, Lindsay Templeton, Don Culpepper, and Damani White-Lewis, and hopefully you'll find them useful. In addition, I wrote myself 2 papers with TIA that have a lot of concrete examples from other institutions of these alternative pathways. I also interviewed the provost about the change process that they had, for example, at IUPUI or WPI in putting some of these things in place. So I just want to also, if we scale out to the wider view, then we would say that one of the reasons this matters is that reward systems are more than just what's on paper. They're really regard systems, right? So if we stretch out the idea of a reward system, it's everything from how a job is constructed and who gets that line in a university or department, to what is valued and signaled in the process of hiring, to pre third year review or annual contract review for professional track faculty. It stretches out all the way to when somebody is what is valued in emeritus, right? But also it's important because a lot of our aspirations, a lot of our insecurities about as an institution, they get carried in to personnel processes, right? And so we see if the institution is worried about moving up in rankings, about moving up in herd, rankings, we see that carried into decisions and operationalized in reward systems. Also, we see that a lot of reward system work happens in these in-between spaces that are not formally in our policies and procedures, but it's what's said in the hallway, what's communicated, what's signaled at an institution. So when we think about transforming associate to full promotion, we need to not just focus, it's very important to focus on the policies and the practices and the mentoring and the training, but to look at these other places where we're signaling and where regard systems are playing out. And you've identified so many different important reasons why this work is important, and I'll just signal 3 that we talked about in our ACE report. Of course, the first one being DEI, and we have much evidence, including some really exciting NSF work by folks recently that has been able to chart differences in department versus college versus university decisions for Hispanic and Black candidates in terms of the degree to which these tenure votes are unanimous or not. That's come out of Rice and a partnership of about 10 institutions that shows that minoritized faculty have experienced discrimination in our reward systems. In particular, epistemic exclusion about work that's focused on issues related to that have some connection to minoritized groups, work that's qualitative. We have to change our reward systems because in many ways they were not built to recognize microaggressions or implicit biases that are affecting our evaluation systems. But also we have much larger percentage of folks that are professional track now than tenure track on most of our campuses. And we need to change faculty evaluation to be inclusive of career ladders for folks, associate to full within lecturer lines. There's just a number of ways in which the way in which we appoint people in the kinds of, say, director roles, administrative roles, more work that's being in online programs is really started to change. And, Gordon Gee made this point at West Virginia. They, of course, have had some ups and downs in trying to get some reward system work through. And our colleague, Associate Provost Melissa Latimer, has done so much important work in the field. But before that, Gordon Gee had actually been writing about the fact that there are very few incentives for faculty either on the professional track before career ladders are created, or moving from associate to full, and the inability to reward and recognize people for great work, whether that be in teaching innovation, supporting first generation students, DEI work, could be engaged scholarship extension, but the inability to have tools to recognize people on career ladders or for this newer form of scholarship that institutions are asking them to do means the institution can't achieve its mission, right? It's like holding folks back. It's making institutions stuck. I was also recently last year at the Euro meeting, which came out with a Boyer report that noted, these 11 areas where if institutions are going to follow an equity imperative to really transform themselves to be supportive of by race, by first generation, they need to take on these things that are holding them back. And one of them was, of course, faculty rewards and structure. One of the guiding frameworks that I've used in thinking about this work with colleagues is the phenomenal work of USC Professor Emeritus Dr. Estela Bensimo. And she's done this work with many colleagues over the years. But I wanted to credit some of her earlier work there and basically saying equity-minded work takes institutional ownership for things that previously we assumed somebody was sort of on their own to deal with, right? So for example, if we have students or, other kinds of peer reviews that are racist, sexist, homophobic, and before the candidate sort of, well, what are they going to, there was no way to understand and own the fact, what's happening here. Institutions increasingly from an equity-minded perspective say, wait a minute, those are not our values. That's not an equitable process. We are going to take on the fact that happened, and we are going to figure out a way to create a more equitable process out of it. In other words, we have to take ownership not just for the intention of creating an equitable process, but the outcomes, right? And this work is really been important in shaping a lot of equity-minded reform, whether it be in hiring, in teaching and learning spaces, and thinking even most recently about presidential searches. All right, I'd like to just give a few examples, and I think that you, in your white paper and also in some of the work that you're doing on your campus, have begun to explore a variety of these things. So I'm going to go through them somewhat quickly, but I wanted to provide some concrete examples of ways in which institutions are trying to improve policies and practices and new pathways for folks like Robin, Darius, and Sam. So we know that the traditional research university model is primarily discovery, and that means that folks that are doing interdisciplinary and engaged teaching scholarship have a hard time finding legitimacy for many of the journals that might be considered in an old hierarchy a B or C level journal, but they are the journals that publish this work, right? And likewise, finding funding sources that are going to fund, contracts and other kinds of foundation sources. In addition, there's an intersection between that and faculty of color experiencing sort of informal hierarchies of the kind of work we're doing in a discipline. And the University of Michigan STRIDE program and developed a training led by Professor Isis Settles that is just fantastic in thinking through the degree to which some subfields within all of our disciplines might be considered core versus on the perimeters of a field by virtue of which journals they get in and funding sources, et cetera. And that will affect how we evaluate scholarship. And so the principle in trying to reform this is, to try to add context and clarity to our processes is really to provide examples of alternative forms of scholarship that would count relevant to the discipline. So if you're an economist, naming kinds of proceedings or kinds of data, kinds of products that might be considered in the definition you've created for scholarship, so that folks have concrete examples of what would be considered in there. And there's, of course, been some wonderful work on this by many disciplinary associations, including MLA, places like Purdue, UNC Greensboro, that have really created more detailed strategies for evaluating alternative products from the traditional empirical article or history, book kind of a thing. I just wanted to provide a couple of examples. I did work with WPI at one point while they were revising their materials, and I love their definition, and this is very consistent with yours with the exception of the 5 areas. I also like the University of Memphis definition that talks about the nature of scholarship and what it does. One of the related issues then, if we think about what is the content of scholarship, and then we move to, well, how are we measuring the impact of those products, right? So discovery, if you have a traditional empirical journal article, that might get, we might look at impact in terms of how often it's cited. But if somebody is doing work in a school district that is intended to, let's say, lower childhood obesity by increasing awareness about health and fitness, then what they're trying for is not citation count. It's actually more like behavioral change, right? And that would be the same from Robin's example of reaching for they're trying to help patients increase strength. And so one of the reforms that's happening right now is really to try to build in examples of ways in which candidates can make the case that the impacts of their work is affecting practices, innovations, capacity for community organizations, changes in laws, or public awareness on issues. And really the focus here is centering the presentation of impact, not the kind of impact. So in the story I told, you heard them saying, well, give us your citations, and it'd be nice if you want to, it's fine if you want to mention a few other things, but really focus on that. Well, if the whole focus of somebody's work was really on changing behavior or conditions, then that doesn't make a lot of sense, and it's also disadvantaging that work. One of the other things that's happening in a few institutions is a more institutionalization of alternative tracks, where folks can go up for tenure in a few cases or promotion to full, emphasizing a particular aspect of work. And in this case, I would highlight the IUPUI DEI case. And in this case, it's actually going up for, can be going up for tenure. And it builds on prior work that they had done with different tracks. But this is a really interesting piece that we're watching. It's like one of those watch those spaces that Rachel Maddow says, right? To see what happens with this. But they're kind of going first. And it's kind of, I think, a really important way in which they're recognizing the work that folks are doing and legitimizing and showing how it can be evaluated. You also heard in that example this issue of how long it took to get there. When I first became director of the advanced program, one of the things that was really interesting was to look at associate to full and years of that it took and what the average number of years were. And in fact, we put that into a dashboard behind a firewall that we created so that folks would know in the College of Education at the time that I was doing this, I think it was about 8 years versus in engineering, it was about 5. And then we looked at whether there were gender kinds of differences as well as race. And one of the things for gender that was interesting was that there were differences, gender differences, especially in more in non-STEM fields. And part of that had to do with the greater ambiguity about what was enough and mattered in those spaces. So in any event, one of the things that institutions have started to do is to make it much clearer that it's not about the number of years you're on a particular track that have to be lockstep, but identifying a bar, a wide bar with multiple forms of scholarship to climb over of a high expectation. And but it's about reaching that bar and crossing over it. And it's not about how long you were trying to do that, right? And so, you see WVU, for example, that said a long-term associate professor will not be penalized for an extended period or limited productivity as long as more recent quantitative and qualitative productivity has been regularly achieved and maintained. There's not been a lot of empirical work on this idea of whether or not your guidelines will focus on your scholarship, your entire sort of compendium of work versus will focus on just your last 5 years or everything you've published from associate to full. I can actually see pros and cons on both of those from the issue that I'm raising here. I think that in reality, it's almost always really based on your full extent of your body of work, because, for example, with citations, they don't just start when you're an associate professor, right? There's a cumulative advantage and disadvantage that happens, or like a Matthew effect. It's something to look at, but I think this idea of not tying the promotion to looking at years, but looking specifically at accomplishments across a bar is really important. Likewise, you saw UC Davis make this sort of let's get rid of time-dependent metrics. One of the thorny issues we have, especially in associate to professor advancement, are associate professors who become department chairs, who become the chair of the DEI task force, who really take on these large roles. And so one part of that is a workload issue, right? And perhaps if we had differentiated workloads, that would help with that issue. Because a greater proportion of what they'd be expected to do would switch from research to some of these other categories in their evaluation. But absent that, we have a real issue that we're facing in every kind of annual evaluation for all faculty, which is, a lack of a systematic way to report this work. You just think about how we report journal articles or books. There is a section of a CV. It is a very linear, whereas you'll often find DEI work and service work in multiple places in the CV, unaccumulated. Individuals will go up, and because of the nature of decision, never know if that work mattered, even when they're successful, not know that that made a difference. It's not clear what the weight of it is. There's just not a lot. It's just very unstructured and unscripted how to evaluate this work. Some of the things we're seeing happening to change that are, a retraining of personnel committees and equity charges that more clearly ask for some more scripted, whether that be a decision support tool like a rubric, a more deliberative decision-making process where you move through all of the teaching for each of the candidates, then you move through all the, research, deliberative kind of decision-making processes. Clear policy language that actually asks for that shows what the amount of service that somebody would be expected to do, and then allows you to see when somebody is above, at, or below that. Because the the lack of recognizing when people are below helps diminish the people that are above. So both are really important. I'll just point out in the DEI space, of course, University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign had this somewhat bold statement. And of course, this is a contested terrain right now in many parts of the country. But nonetheless, this sort of saying DEI is our work, our collective work. We would like people in their faculty evaluation process to say how this matters. And you see a number of these examples in the UC system. External letters are another way in which we're seeing some great reform. I have to say, as a professor who's been writing tenure and promotion to full letters, I was really excited last summer when I received my instructions as an external evaluator, and I got at least 4 different models of how the institution was signaling their values and their criteria to me that were very much in line with best practices. So for example, signaling to me, this person is in an administrative role that's 50%. In general, we would expect somebody to have done about this much scholarship. So given their 50%, we would expect this person to have done about half that. That's really clear. And another institution explaining their commitment to engage scholarship and alternative products and the kinds of things that they value in engaged scholarship in terms of reciprocity and partnerships, and asking me to pay attention to those things as a reviewer. This actually really signals that, that this matters to the institution. And I would also, I'm not going to read all of these, and this is in the things that we've published, but really getting rid of anything that takes the context away. For example, being very clear that as an external reviewer, you are applying the criteria of the department's you're applying the candidate's department criteria to their case, not applying wherever I am as an external reviewer to the case. But there's a number of these kinds of things that have to be cleaned up to add context and appropriateness and fairness and equity to our evaluation processes. And, because we're still in a time when that had been the norm, we have some institutions that have explicitly started saying in their guidelines, here's what not to do. And hopefully that'll get just taken out, right? Because we will get used to this and stop doing it, and we won't have to say what not to do. But you see Ohio State saying evaluators should specifically be asked not to comment on whether the candidate should be promoted and tenured at their own institution, right? In this case, at Ohio State, right? They're not saying, tell us whether you think we should, right? Or be promoted. Rather, just talk about the scholarship. That's what we're inviting you to do. The most important piece of that to me is tenured at your own institution, meaning like, don't say at the University of Maryland, this person would be promoted, because it's irrelevant. They have not been a faculty member there in any event. In terms of multiple pathways, we have faculty with a mosaic of talent doing many different kinds of work, and we've got institutions beginning to formalize alternative pathways. So for example, I've already mentioned IUPUI's DEI pathway to tenure, which you can look at. I'll also point out WVU's administrative pathway to full. I wrote about this in the TIA pathway. I interviewed Melissa Latimer about this. They've only had a few people go through it. But what's interesting about it is that very quietly, a good number of other research universities, without it being an Inside Higher Ed and the Chronicle, have similar kinds of policies that have been enacted, where somebody, before they, once assuming an associate dean or department chair position, can say, for the next 5 years, I'm going to focus on excellence in administrative leadership. At the end of that time, therefore, I will go up for full, and I will be able to show excellent contributions in this area, which will have been about 60% of my portfolio, 20% teaching, let's say, and 20% scholarship, as opposed to what might normally be a higher percent of scholarship. And, it's done by MOU, by mutual agreement. And I think it provides a way that an individual who agrees to take on these important roles and even is going to do very well for the institution doesn't have to wait to be promoted till they come back into their teaching career and then have to go, start again and miss out on advancement opportunities in that process. And I think you're also aware of WPI's teaching pathway to tenure, which at this point is, those individuals, of course, would be able to go to full once they are at that point. It's a new program. I'll also point out, and I'm sure you're aware because I know at your institution that you already have bias training and various kinds of support for faculty committees. But the University of Michigan STRIDE training, not just for hiring, but also for evaluation and again on issues of epistemic exclusion, I think is excellent. UMass Amherst has also done some excellent training on issues of evaluation for personnel committees, as has UMass Lowell. So I'm winding up here, aware of time, but I want to say also, and we could talk about when we meet, issues of workload and transparency in terms of what folks are doing. So I've been involved for the last 6 years in a project with colleagues to look at how we can provide data, how departments can look at their own data about the amount of service, mentoring, and other kinds of sort of academic housekeeping kinds of work that folks are doing that is not counted in their annual review or their evaluation processes. And first of all, more equitably share that work at a department level, beginning with a process of looking at that data and making sure it's clear what common expectations are for work in that area, making sure everybody's doing their share, and then making sure that work is credited in their allocation of time and effort. And we can talk a little bit more about that. But as we think again about reward systems as regard systems, it's not, the reward system isn't only about what's in the policies. It's also about how your time is being recognized and credited, and the work that you're doing is being seen and made visible on the pathway. So that's what a lot of workload reform is trying to do. And we also publish some good resources in this regard. All right, let's get back to Darius, Robin, and Sam. Let's imagine it's 5 years later and their institution has made a number of changes to their policies and practices for promotion to full. So they broadened the definition of scholarship, but perhaps more importantly, they also created a repository of examples of folks who have successfully made the case for the excellence of their work for promotion. Particularly in engaged scholarship and the scholarship of teaching and learning pathways. Department and college guidelines now include parameters, as you developed, for committees that help them assess engaged scholarship and the scholarship of teaching and their impacts. Candidates and personnel committees are provided guidance and support. So the thing is, we can make a difference for Robin, Darius, and Sam. We can create clearer pathways, more agency-enhancing pathways. We can, I'm just going to stop sharing there. We can, we can make these pathways more equitable, agency-enhancing, and clearer. And small wins really do matter. They do. So I challenge all of us to think about what that next step is. I know that you've done amazing work with this white paper and are all most likely in departments re-looking at your department guidelines, mentoring processes, and what will we do next is the question. And I look forward to discussing those possibilities with you when we meet next week. Thank you.